Recently, I did a video pointing out all the negatives and criticisms that I saw with modern Star Trek. Things that I think have plagued or have been exacerbated in the storytelling of this current era of Trek since basically around Star Trek 2009, and that weren't in or as pronounced in previous eras of Star Trek. And I tried to present that in a way that felt constructive and trying to be as kind and open as possible about what I saw as just some issues, and not doing it in the way some other YouTubers do it, which is just to say,
"Oh my god, let's destroy Alex Kurtzman and his SJWBS."
You know, that kind of way. And if you want to see that video where I go into all my critiques of modern Trek, I put that right here, or here. One of the two, I'm not entirely sure. But as many of you know, I hate to be the one who ends on a negative. Plus, as many of you know, I'm actually quite a fan of modern Star Trek. I mean, literally wearing a Discovery shirt. But why am I a fan of modern Star Trek, especially when I see all those negatives? Well, because I think there are certain things that this era of Star Trek does better than any era that has come before, and I want to take this video to point them out. The things in this video are all going to be things that I think are specifically positive to modern Trek, or at the very least, more pronounced and drawn out than in previous Treks. There may be a few things that other Star Treks have done that I'll mention here, but I think that modern Star Trek does it in a very particularly strong way as opposed to what was done previously.
Hit it.
First and foremost, I think perhaps the most obvious thing to know about modern Star Trek is its serialization, or stories that have been told over multiple episodes rather than single episodes like in most iterations of previous Trek. And again, don't get me wrong, I don't think that serialization is an inherently better storytelling method than episodic storytelling. They're both simply different beasts with different intentions, capabilities, positives, and negatives. Episodic storytelling, for example, can leave a viewer feeling more satisfied at the end of a single episode, as well as better communicate a single idea more effectively than serialized stories can.
None that I know of. I'd be more than willing to put it behind me.
Then perhaps you would do me the pleasure of getting this ship underway.
Serialized storytelling can do all that as well, but it's often much simpler and stronger in episodic storytelling. Additionally, I don't wish to ignore that previous iterations of Trek, namely Star Trek Enterprise Season 3 and a little bit of Season 4, and literally pretty much all of Deep Space Nine, also had elements of serialization. Those shows definitely did, but I think modern Trek does serialization slightly differently than those shows did, though Enterprise Season 3 comes closest. Namely, I rather enjoy a show that tells a single, confined story over the course of a single season. The problem I often have with serialized television nowadays is that often the serialized story takes place over the course of the show's entire run. Think more specifically of Game of Thrones, where every single episode and season, from episode 1 to the very last episode of the show, were all telling the same through-line story, with some mini arcs and deviations throughout, but still always pushing forward that main central story arc. Now, this can certainly build excitement and anticipations between seasons, as we all know as fans of Game of Thrones, but it also leaves me feeling kind of frustrated too. I think back to literally every season finale of Game of Thrones, and just that feeling of anxiousness and frustration that I was going to have to, with seasons of TV shows now being truncated to just 2 months of the year instead of in previous decades where it would be spread out over 3/4 of the year. I was going to have to wait a full freaking year, if not
2 years, goddamn you, TNG.
to get the next piece of the story after a huge cliffhanger at the end of the season. It's not like Star Trek The Next Generation's Best of Both Worlds Part 1 to Part 2, where the wait was only a couple months.
Mr. Worf. Fire.
One eternity later.
The Borg ship is undamaged.
And even that was agonizing, I hear, for many fans at the time who was watching Next Generation during that era. The other issue with series-long storytelling that a lot of us Game of Thrones fans know is that if the ending is unsatisfying, it almost always retroactively makes the rest of the series look worse.
And who has a better story than Bran the Broken?
I mean, for me, I was hoping to rewatch Game of Thrones when it was all done, but knowing where it all ends, it inherently made it less satisfying to watch a second time around because I know where the payoff is going or where it isn't going. So it all kind of feels a little bit worse. It's not to say that Game of Thrones was a bad show overall, the earlier seasons are still great, but it does kind of make them a little bit worse in retrospect. I think honestly, my favorite type of storytelling style is a single season long arc, which both Discovery and Picard have completely focused on. Each season of the show tells its own distinct story that, for the most part, completely wraps up by the end of the season, with little hints and mini arcs going between seasons and a new story teased at the very end of the season, to begin things fresh next year. This allows me the fun of speculating what's going to happen week to week on a show, which, as a YouTuber who loves to overanalyze things, is like a drug to me. It also leaves me feeling satisfied and not anxiously waiting over the next piece of the story over interminable months. But it also lets me still have fun speculating over what's in store. It's kind of like having your cake and eating it too, and I love that. It also means that if a story doesn't wrap up well, like in my opinion Star Trek Discovery Season 2 did, I didn't particularly love how all those plot threads wrapped up in that season, even though I liked the season overall, it still means that a show can still move forward in a satisfying way. I'm very excited for Star Trek Picard. I'm very excited for Star Trek Discovery Season 3. I mean, I'm excited for Star Trek Picard Season 3, but we kind of have to get through Season 2 first, so that was, I'm jumping the gun a little bit. If we ever get there. Oh gosh, the world is crazy right now, isn't it? Now, the next item on my list of positives is something that actually speaks to a lot of the stuff that's coming up and not actually here yet, though a little bit of stuff that's coming here yet, and that's diversity in both stories and characters. Now, let's start with the most obvious definition of the word, the one that everyone thinks of when they hear the word diversity. And dear heavens, I know by simply saying the word diversity, there's already going to be at least one of you out there who's gone down to the comments to rant about SJWs ruining their precious Star Trek, hashtag screw CBS, hashtag Kurtzman has been fired for the 10th time this year. But for those of you who are somewhat reasonable, who understand that one, diversity is an inherently good thing overall, not just for representing typically underrepresented people and allowing for humanity to come up with better ideas because of multiple viewpoints, but also actually increases the amount of storytelling potential that you have on a show. Just having more diversity of characters means that your stories are going to be inherently more interesting because you have more different types of characters instead of the same type of person with the same type of background over and over and over again. And number two, the extreme overt messaging about the importance of diversity has been a part of Star Trek since its inception.
Leave any bigotry in your quarters. There's no room for it on the bridge.
If you believe those two things, I actually think modern Trek gets diversity better in front of and behind the camera than any other Star Trek before it. Certainly every Star Trek has been diverse, but in Discovery and Picard particularly, there's just so many people of different genders, identities, backgrounds, sexual orientations, and more. And that includes you too, straight white men. I love you very much, so don't feel left out. I mean, look at Captain Pike and his glorious lumberjack beard. How can you not love that? I know I do. Now, I know I got a lot of flack recently for a video I did on the upcoming Pike show, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, having 3 white leads. But to be clear with that video, I was just presenting the question for open discussion, not actively hating on the show that isn't even out yet. Unlike, some YouTubers who do that pretty much all the time with any Trek show. But if this era of Star Trek has shown us anything, it's that it's continuing to and doubling down on Gene Roddenberry's commitment to diversity. And this, by the way, includes behind the camera. Previous Star Treks mostly were written and directed by a lot of dudes, with some notable exceptions. Again, I love Ron Moore and Ira Steven Behr, they're some of my favorite writers on television, but I love how modern Star Trek has included crew members like Hanelle Culpepper as director and Michelle Paradise and Kristen Byers as showrunners. Again, this isn't to say that there were no women in Star Trek's past. There were many, many, many who made a lot of really great contributions, including the only DC Fontana to be one of the most prominent, but not the only. But I also think the fact that Hanelle Culpepper was the first black woman to direct an episode of Star Trek in Discovery's first season says a lot about the failures of past Trek in its crew selection, and so much about the positives of this generation of Star Trek. Hell, modern Star Trek has even started an internship program to allow diverse film students to work on and learn while working on Star Trek, which makes me honestly really upset that I graduated 6 years ago and can no longer take part in that program. But also, modern Star Trek has taken great strides in terms of diversity in its storytelling. As I said before, a diverse group of people allows you to tell diverse stories. And also, I praised the serialized storytelling of both Picard and Discovery, but both of those shows are different in the types of stories they tell and how they tell them, even with similar structure backbones. Hell, Discovery's main character isn't even a captain, which was something that every single Star Trek show up until this point had done, and Picard barely has any Starfleet in it at all. Those are both firsts for Star Trek, and I love that this era of Star Trek is expanding the Trek universe in that way. And future Star Trek seem to be doing that too, with Star Trek Strange New Worlds returning to a classic Trek feel in episodic stories, which will give us that era that we kind of liked with Star Trek, and Star Trek Lower Decks flipping that structure on its head to focus on ensigns instead of the bridge crew. And then we also get the animated Nickelodeon show that will bring Trek to a new generation, a next generation, if you will. Sorry, had to do it. It was kind of obvious. It was low-dangling fruit there. But each of these Star Trek shows has its own flavor and does something different, and that's something that even past Treks didn't do. Star Trek The Next Generation, Voyager, and even Enterprise for its first couple of years were all pretty much the same show with a slightly different setting and new characters in the same exact type of crew roles, Deep Space Nine as always being the notable exception. It's why Star Trek as a franchise got fatigued towards the 4th season of Enterprise, and why, while I'm sure we'll hit a saturation point of Star Trek at some point in the future, that I have confidence that this era of Star Trek will still be running strong for several years, much to the chagrin of certain people. And this goes to another thing I love about modern Trek: risk. And I don't want to harp on this point because I think both my discussion on diversity and serialization points this out, but modern Star Trek takes so many risks. The problem with previous Star Trek, which was so clear most prominently in Star Trek Enterprise, is that Trek often lost its ability to take storytelling risks. Enterprise had so much potential, and showrunner Brandon Braga had so much that he wanted to try, include setting the first season of the show entirely on Earth, or showing the NX-01 being damaged and not repaired between episodes. But that didn't end up happening because the studio wanted their next cookie-cutter Star Trek show. It's why later seasons of Enterprise and Deep Space Nine, which finally broke out of the formula of previous Treks that had been established in the original series and Next Generation, are so beloved by fans. Because they were risks, they tried something new even if they weren't perfect. Just like the Next Generation was a risk when it first came on the air. And sure, Discovery and Picard haven't completely nailed their storytelling, just like the Next Generation, early Deep Space Nine, and Enterprise didn't. That's because they are trying something new. And the more time passes, the more they master what they're trying to say. And again, it's why I'm so pumped for Star Trek Discovery Season 3, which is the first season the show has had a stable, creative team, with most of the writers having at least half of a season of the show on their belt. Writing takes time to master when you're starting something new. No Star Trek series was perfect off the bat, except for maybe the original series. Because Star Trek is so unique in how it tells stories, and I'd rather a creative team commit to that aspect of Trek, a franchise that has always boldly gone forward with its storytelling, than trying to stay true to a storytelling formula that was popular 30 or even 50 years ago.
Risk is our business. That's what the Starship is all about. That's why we're aboard her.
Okay, so for my final two positives, they're easily going to be my most contentious because I know that there are some out there who would disagree with my two concepts that I'll be illustrating here. Some of them are toxic, as I've joked about throughout this video, but I also wish to acknowledge that there are many people who are well-meaning and not toxic who would disagree with me on these assessments, and that's totally okay. If you disagree with my points and you don't think the things that I think are positive are actually positives, that's totally fine. You're allowed to disagree with me as long as you're not toxic about it, and I've done videos on what the distinction between the two is. But getting back to my point, I believe that modern Trek and the creators behind it actively listen to fans, but also know when to not listen to us. For example, two criticisms of Star Trek Discovery Season 1 was its darker tone and the fact that we didn't even know the names of most of the bridge crew, even if they weren't main characters. So, literally, what are the first two things that Star Trek Discovery Season 2 did?
Bridge crew, give me a roll call. Lord knows what's waiting for us down there. I want to know who I'm facing it with. Sound off.
They brightened the tone and told us the names of the characters on the bridge. Now, that wasn't the only criticism, but I also think the very fact that we got a Captain Pike show, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, is a testament to the fans being heard by the creators. But the creators do this also in other ways too. Picard showrunner Michael Chabon did a Q&A Instagram session after every single episode of Star Trek Picard, for example. The writers also have acknowledged their mistakes, like when they did the bury your gaze trope in Star Trek Discovery Season 1 and brought back Culber for Season 2. Now again, they aren't perfect as I've mentioned. I did a whole video on the negatives, I think, of modern Star Trek, but I do think that they listen to fans and also know that sometimes they have to trust their own instincts, like sticking with the serialization of the shows, which many fans have argued that they don't like. But I do think they listen to us as much as some other people would say otherwise. And perhaps they even arguably do so more than previous treks, where producers often seem to have active disdain for the fan base. But this final positive that I want to talk about, I know is going to be the most contentious, because it's one that I think pretty much has been the main dividing line for the fan base between those who love and hate modern Star Trek. And again, I think that can be done toxically or non-toxically. I'm not saying those who hate modern Star Trek for this reason are wrong. And I'll be honest, this one comes down a lot to personal preference. So I will say it's a positive for me personally, but not for everyone. And that's the fact that I think it is a positive that modern Star Trek isn't afraid to challenge Star Trek at its core and deconstruct the franchise as a whole, often leading to what many refer to as a darker tone. Though I would disagree that modern Star Trek has a darker tone, but I think the reason that people point that out is because it's doing a deconstruction of Star Trek. Now, I am planning to do another video discussing this topic with hopefully a few other Star Trek YouTubers in the vein of one that I did with Steve Shives and Council of Geeks, but to mention in brief here my basic ideas on this topic, modern Trek takes a look at what Star Trek stands for, what its ideals are, and attempts to look for cracks in that surface. From Star Trek Discovery Season 1 challenging and asking how Starfleet holds on to its ideals of a better humanity during wartime, to Picard's first season showing how a Federation who believes so much in its own utopia, how it could easily ignore its own prejudices or the plights of those in need. Many of us, myself included, were attracted to Star Trek specifically because it showed us a future where humanity was bright, where we had evolved ourselves. It's why I love Star Trek, because it showed me that we can and will be better if we trust in the better natures of ourselves and try to fight out and weed out the worst parts of ourselves. But Star Trek was also a show that was conceived in the 1960s, and a lot of the ideals it held, while certainly ahead of their time for then, are now somewhat outdated. Not all of them, but look at the Prime Directive, for example. Certainly there was a kernel of a good idea there, especially during the era of the Vietnam War. But Star Trek's decades-long adherence to that concept has shown its flaws in many ways that past Treks weren't ready to address. I mean, look at the Star Trek Enterprise episode, Dear Doctor, which tried so hard to justify the Prime Directive and make it apply to a more modern context of the 2000s era politics in which Enterprise was made, that it accidentally made Captain Archer indirectly responsible for a mass genocide. Star Trek needs to grow and evolve, and part of that process of growing is being able to discuss and weed out what it's gotten right over the years and what we need to keep, and question what it's gotten wrong and needs to be gotten rid of.
You can't avoid a little ugliness from within and from without.
Only then can Star Trek survive for another 50 years, and that's something that I really want. I want Star Trek to go on indefinitely. As long as humanity needs to hear the message of infinite diversity and infinite combinations, that's how long I want Star Trek to last. And sure, Discovery and Picard's more cynical look at the Federation and Starfleet are part of these growing pains, but they are necessary parts of the process for both the writers and us as fans to learn what we want to keep about Star Trek and what we don't. And honestly, I find this whole process just fascinating to watch. And not incidentally, for a franchise that's always been incredibly political, that same questioning of our ideals mirrors a lot of what Americans have been forced to do when looking at our own government and politics in recent years. Perhaps a show like Star Trek, which has basically been an outgrowth of American idealism, is also mirroring the political consciousness of the country it created and directly discusses. But, you know, as always,
Hashtag keep politics out of my Star Trek.
But no, not really. Now, I do think that Trek can and should grow past this cynical look to try to once again show us a future worth fighting for, not a future that we need to question. And I think that Star Trek is starting to do that with Star Trek Strange New Worlds on the horizon and quite possibly Star Trek Discovery Season 3 and Star Trek Picard Season 2 as well. But this deconstruction of what Star Trek is and means to us was always going to be needed and always needed to happen if we wanted Star Trek to continue.
I would hope there are bright young people growing up all the time who will bring to it levels and areas that were beyond me. And I don't feel jealous about that at all. I think that, as I was saying, Hollywood, the motion picture industry is a remarkable thing. And it'll go on without any of us and get better and better and better, because that really is the human condition, is to improve and improve.
Alright, those are all of my positives for the modern era of Star Trek, at least the main ones. There are some other ones here and there, but those are the big ones that I kind of wanted to address and tackle with this video. But do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? What are your positives of modern Trek, or do you think there are no positives at all? I'd love to hear all that down in the comments below. And also, don't forget to give this channel a subscribe if you want more discussions of Star Trek and modern Trek and other social and political issues through geek topics. That's what this channel is all about, so give this channel a subscribe. And if you want to... And I do this ramble so often, I'm just kind of slurring the words together. But if you want to help make these videos even better, consider giving to my Patreon page. Every little bit helps, especially right now during the current crisis going on in the world. It really means a lot to me and helps me during this kind of rougher financial period right now. But regardless if you subscribe or comment or give to my Patreon, I'm just glad that you stopped by, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Thank you so much to all of my patrons, especially right now considering everything that's going on in the world. You keep me motivated and you help me continue doing this channel every single month. I could not do it without you. And a special thanks to my patrons, Polymena, Mystic the Monarchete, Bree Beecher, Din Hagney, Dante St. James, Anti-Cat808, Patrick Shannon, Wayne Twitchell, Wen Dizzle Bizzle, Subraxis, Zach Cody, Maeve, Jason Knott, Maggie Evans, Christy Marie Johnson, Gavin Robinson, William Stewart, Michael Beam, Miranda Janelle, Mari Neckar, Lorena Mesa, Wellington Marcus, Susan Banks, Buttoneer, Ish the Mad, Ashley Allen Bociccio, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Stefan Schuhart, Greg Gillum, Christina Dalliance, Ashlyn Solstice, and Eli Bergmoss. Thank you to all of you.